Turn around and show me that I'm not mistaken. I still hear his voice. It echoes in my mind as I sit here, trying to process the shock of what just happened. David, my stepfather, has never spoken to me like that before. His tone was firm, almost challenging, and his eyes burned with an intensity one had never seen. I know exactly what he meant by those words, even if I refuse to admit it to myself. A few weeks ago, things started to change. David began to pay attention to me in ways that went far beyond the usual concern. At first, it seemed harmless. Small gifts here, casual compliments there, and occasional invitations to join him in the living room when my mother was away. I assumed he was simply trying to be supportive, but as days turned into weeks, his behavior took on a different, more unsettling quality. I remember the day I wore the short dress he had given me. It was an ordinary afternoon, and I had been in a good mood. I sat in the living room while he read the newspaper. Out of nowhere, he set the paper aside and said quietly, "You have no idea how special you are." I managed a small smile. I knew what his words implied, even if I chose not to respond. I decided then that I would not let him dictate the pace of events. I would wait, watch him closely, and let him show his true intentions. That night, the house was unusually quiet. My mother had gone to bed early, and I was left alone with David. As the evening wore on, his presence became more intrusive. He moved closer and his tone grew even more personal. Every word, every gesture, hinted at a boundary he was eager to cross. I sat still, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. I was aware of the inappropriateness of his actions, yet I felt a strange thrill at the prospect of challenging him. I resolved to remain composed and to wait for the moment when he might slip. The tension in the room was palpable. I watched him carefully as he made deliberate movements, the way he adjusted his seat, the way his hand lingered near mine even when he pretended to read. It was clear that he was testing limits. In those moments, I realized that he saw me not as the young girl I once was, but as someone who could be molded into his idea of perfection. I knew where this was heading, yet I chose not to interrupt his process. Then came the moment that changed everything. Later that evening, while we were sitting together in the living room after dinner, David leaned in. His voice dropped to a low, steady tone as he repeated, "Turn around and show me that I'm not mistaken." The words hung in the air. I felt a mix of fear, anger, and an odd sense of control. I stared at him, trying to determine if he was serious or if this was just another one of his tests. I took a deep breath and met his gaze evenly. "I know what you're implying," I said calmly. My voice was steady, even as my heart pounded. I did not raise my voice or act defiant, but my expression gave nothing away. In that charged silence, I knew that every move from now on would determine the course of our relationship. I had to be careful, to balance my caution with the need to protect myself. I was not ready to let him have the upper hand completely. As the minutes passed, I felt the weight of his words settle over us. David's eyes never left mine, and I sensed that he expected a reaction, a sign that I would either accept or reject his advances. I chose to remain silent, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity, and I knew that the choices I made in the next few moments would be critical. I also realized that I was at a crossroads. If I allowed him to continue, nothing would ever be the same. Yet, part of me was curious about where this dangerous game would lead. I had to keep control. I decided then that I would not be a passive participant in this twisted scenario. I would observe, learn his moves, and use my knowledge to steer the situation, whatever the cost. The quiet in the room was deafening. I could hear my own breathing as I weighed my options. I recalled every compliment, every unwanted gesture from the past few weeks, and understood that the situation was escalating quickly. Tonight was a turning point. I could almost sense that what happened next would change everything, and I braced myself for the inevitable clash of wills. I know that the coming moments will be even more intense. The stakes are high, and the path forward is uncertain. I have no idea what his next move will be, but I do know one thing. I will not let him control this narrative. I will wait for that moment when he finally loses his control, and I will be ready. I leave you with this thought. The night is far from over, and what comes next might just be the most dangerous part of this game. The next day, David invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant. I accepted his invitation without hesitation. Later, my mother questioned why I was chosen instead of her, remarking, "We rarely spend time together with Brooke." His casual explanation did little to hide the underlying intent, and I already sensed that today's meeting was more than just a friendly lunch. At the restaurant, the atmosphere was modern and efficient. David reserved a private table in a secluded corner to ensure our conversation remained uninterrupted. Once we were seated, he ordered a costly bottle of wine and arranged for the service to be discreet. Every detail was handled with precision, as if designed to create an environment where nothing would distract from the discussion. David began the conversation by discussing practical matters about my future. "You should think more about yourself," he said steadily while maintaining direct eye contact. "You have the potential to achieve everything you want if you focus on your own ambitions." As he spoke, his hand rested briefly on mine, a touch that was deliberate and measured. Although his tone was composed, I sensed that his interest in me extended beyond simple concern. I responded with a controlled nod and a slight, non-committal smile. I was fully aware that every word and gesture was carefully calculated. Despite his outwardly supportive language, the subtext of his remarks hinted at a hidden agenda. The way he touched my hand, the intensity of his gaze, these small actions confirmed that our interaction was growing increasingly personal. After our meal, David suggested we continue our conversation with a walk in a nearby park. "Let's get some fresh air," he said. The change in setting felt natural. The formal ambience of the restaurant gave way to the calm, orderly paths of the park. We left the restaurant together and walked side by side along the paved sidewalks, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and scattered benches. During the walk, the conversation shifted from general topics to more personal matters. After several minutes of quiet companionship, we reached a quieter area near a line of mature trees. There, David stopped and turned to face me directly. "You know there is something more between us," he stated plainly. His tone was firm, and there was no ambiguity in his words. I maintained silence, choosing not to respond immediately. My silence was a way to gather my thoughts and assess the situation. In that brief pause, I felt a subtle shift in the balance of power. Up until that moment, David had controlled the interaction, setting the terms and guiding our conversation. Now, I realized, I might have the opportunity to influence the outcome. David continued without waiting for a response. "Our connection isn't just about routine or convenience," he said. "There's something unique here, something that could redefine our relationship." His words were direct, and his steady tone left little room for negotiation. As he spoke, his hand moved again, briefly touching my arm with purpose. I noted every detail, the firmness of his touch, the unwavering look in his eyes, and understood that he expected me to acknowledge the deeper meaning behind his words. Despite the intensity of the moment, I kept my reactions measured. I asked a few clarifying questions about what he meant by something more, but my inquiries were met with straightforward answers. "I see potential for change in both of us," he said simply. "It's not just about what I want, it's about what you could become if you embraced this opportunity." His answers were pragmatic and void of excessive emotion. As we resumed our walk, the conversation took on a reflective tone. David talked about opportunities and potential changes in my life without venturing into overly personal territory. "You have the strength to make significant decisions," he stated, his voice remaining calm and steady. I listened closely, aware that his words were as much about guiding my future as they were about deepening our current connection. We passed a few park benches where other visitors sat quietly, but our focus remained on each other. The steady hum of conversation from nearby groups provided a neutral backdrop as I continued to weigh his words. Every sentence he uttered was deliberate and calculated to move our discussion forward. I realized that this meeting was not just about the present moment, it was setting the stage for a future that would force me to confront difficult decisions. At one point, David paused near a fountain. The water's sound was steady, marking the rhythm of our conversation. "I believe that if you focus on your ambitions, nothing can hold you back," he said while offering his arm briefly as we navigated a slight incline. I accepted the gesture, not as a sign of submission, but as a practical acknowledgement that the conversation was progressing toward matters that would affect my life significantly. The walk eventually brought us back toward the park's entrance. By then, the tone had shifted from casual to one that carried a sense of finality. David's earlier words had established a clear proposition, an expectation that our relationship would evolve into something far more consequential. I was left with no doubt that the discussion had far-reaching implications, even if he had not yet spelled out all the details. Before parting ways, David said, "Think about what I've said today. There is a real opportunity here for change." His tone was firm but not aggressive, and I could tell that he expected a response in the near future. I simply replied, "I will," and then we separated. As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation had fundamentally altered the dynamics between us. During the drive home, I replayed every moment of the day. The lunch meeting, the controlled yet pointed remarks, the walk in the park, it all painted a picture of a man whose interest in me was growing more complicated. I understood that the balance of power was shifting and that I would soon face choices that could redefine my future. Arriving home, I stepped out of the car with a sense of cautious resolve. I knew that today's encounter was only the beginning of a deeper conflict. David's clear statements and deliberate gestures had set in motion a series of events that would force me to make critical decisions in the days ahead. I entered the house without discussing the meeting with anyone. Alone in my room, I reviewed the day's events in my mind. The clarity of his words left little ambiguity. Our interaction had crossed a threshold, and the consequences were imminent. I understood that the conflict between us was deepening, and the next phase of our relationship would challenge everything I thought I knew about control and choice. As I prepared for the evening, one thought was certain: the stakes are rising, and I must decide how much I'm willing to risk. The day had ended, but the tension persisted. What happened today will inevitably lead to a decisive turning point, and I must be ready for whatever comes next. Stay tuned, because the next chapter promises even greater challenges. Following the events of our walk in the park, I began noticing that his presence was becoming increasingly intrusive. Over the past few days, David started appearing in places where I least expected him. One morning, as I was heading to my regular gym session, I spotted his car parked near the entrance. I paused for a moment, confused by his sudden appearance. As I entered the gym, I heard a familiar voice call out, "I was just passing by and thought you might need a ride." I turned to see him leaning casually against his car, a slight smile on his face. There was a strange tenderness in his gaze that did not match the casual tone of his words. I replied with a simple nod and continued with my workout, all the while aware that his actions were no longer coincidental. Later that day, David sent a message inviting me to his office. The invitation was straightforward: "Come by my office. This is only for you. See how I work." Despite knowing that his motives went beyond professional courtesy, I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because I sensed that this was his way of moving our interaction forward. I arrived at his office building, a modern structure with large windows that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The space was sleek and meticulously organized, reflecting his personality and success. Inside his office, David greeted me at the reception before leading me to his private workspace. He pulled out a chair for me and motioned for me to sit next to him. On the desk, several folders and electronic devices were arranged neatly. As he began to show me his ongoing projects, he explained each one with a calm and measured tone. "I want you to see the work that drives me," he said. His explanations were clear and practical, focusing on the details of his business ventures. However, as the minutes passed, the conversation shifted from business to something more personal. While pointing to a detailed chart on his computer screen, he leaned in closer and lowered his voice. "You're the only one who truly understands me," he whispered. His words were delivered softly, yet with an intensity that left little room for misinterpretation. I listened intently, aware that his comments were designed to blur the lines between professional admiration and personal interest. I maintained a neutral expression and answered with short, measured remarks. I asked a few clarifying questions about his projects, ensuring that the discussion stayed grounded in professional matters. Despite my efforts to steer the conversation back to work, I could sense that David was carefully choosing his words to leave an impression on me. His behavior was deliberate, and every action seemed calculated to deepen the connection between us. That evening, as the day came to a close and my mother was already home, I returned to my room only to find a neatly folded note on my desk. The note was short and direct: "We need to talk in private. Don't make me wait." The message was clear, and it added a new layer of urgency to the ongoing conflict between us. It was David's way of signaling that he wanted to take our interactions beyond what had been acceptable so far. I spent the rest of the evening processing the note. I reviewed all the events of the past few days, his unexpected appearances, the casual yet pointed conversation at the gym, and now the invitation to his office that had ended with his personal remark. Each moment built up the tension, and I realized that David's insistence was not only persistent but also increasingly invasive. His actions were no longer limited to isolated incidents. They were becoming a consistent part of my daily life. Despite the clear warning in the note, I felt a mix of apprehension and a cautious curiosity about what might come next. On one level, I was disturbed by the growing frequency of his advances. On another, I recognized that I was gradually shifting my own stance in response. I had started to view his actions as a challenge, a puzzle to be solved rather than a threat to be feared outright. I knew that my next steps would have significant consequences for how our relationship developed. The note left me with a decision to make. I had to decide whether to confront David about his behavior or to allow the situation to escalate further. My mind raced through the potential outcomes. There was no easy answer. The opportunity for a closer connection was undeniable, but so were the risks. Accepting his invitation might mean crossing boundaries that I had once considered inviolable. I resolved to take some time to think through my options. The note was a clear indicator that David intended to push forward without waiting for my consent. I knew that the next phase of our interaction would force me to choose between maintaining my distance or stepping into a situation that could redefine my future. Before the day ended, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not be caught off guard by his next move. I would consider every word and gesture carefully, ensuring that I maintained control over the direction of our relationship. The events of the day had reached a turning point, and I was aware that the stakes were higher than ever. With the note still in my hand, I sat down to plan my next steps. I reviewed the interactions with David, determined to find a way to navigate the conflict without compromising my own values. The challenge was clear. I had to decide how much of myself I was willing to risk for the sake of his persistent interest. As I closed my journal for the night, I recognized that the conflict was far from over. The tension between us had grown steadily, and the next phase of our interactions promised to be even more decisive. I ended the day with a firm resolve. Whatever came next, I would be ready to face it head-on. One evening, David invited me to a concert. "It will be unforgettable," he said. Despite my reservations, and despite my mother's repeated, suspicious questions about why he spent so much time with me, I agreed to go. The concert hall was packed and the atmosphere charged, but my focus was fixed on David. Throughout the performance, he appeared slightly nervous yet did his best to project confidence. I noticed every twitch and pause in his behavior, understanding that his mood had shifted from casual to something more deliberate. After the concert ended, we left the venue together and headed to a nearby bar. The change in setting felt natural. In the subdued lighting of the bar, away from the noise of the concert, our conversation took on a more personal tone. As soon as we settled at a small table in a quiet corner, David leaned forward and said, "You know I am willing to do anything for you." His tone was direct, leaving little room for misinterpretation. At that moment, his hand reached out and touched mine. I pulled my hand back slightly, a brief reaction that masked both my embarrassment and a hidden appreciation for his unexpected vulnerability. Trying to keep the situation under control, I offered a small smile. I knew that David's actions were moving our relationship into uncharted territory. I needed to understand his intentions more clearly. "Why do you always stop halfway, David?" I asked with a light smile, my tone casual yet challenging. My question was intended to prompt an honest explanation, not to provoke an argument. David's eyes dropped to the table, and he hesitated before looking up again. The brief silence between us was filled only by the low murmur of the bar and soft background music. I waited, knowing that his response was crucial. Finally, he met my eyes and spoke quietly, "Because I am afraid of losing you." His admission was succinct and matter-of-fact. There was no grand declaration, just a simple statement that carried the weight of vulnerability. I noted the slight tremor in his hand as he said the words and the way he avoided holding my gaze for too long before steadying himself. His confession revealed a weakness I had not anticipated in someone who always appeared so controlled. I took a moment to process his words before replying in a calm, measured tone. "I appreciate your honesty, David, but you need to understand that I am not someone to be won over by promises alone. I need clarity and consistency." My response was straightforward and left little room for further ambiguity. I wanted him to grasp that while his confession was sincere, it did not resolve the underlying conflict between us or justify the increasing intrusion into my life. David remained silent for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the table as if searching for the right words. The tension at our table had shifted noticeably. What he had just admitted, and what I had said in response, marked a turning point in our interactions. It was clear that our dynamic was changing, moving from a series of calculated gestures to a confrontation with the underlying insecurities that had always driven his behavior. In that quiet moment, with the noise of the bar fading into the background, I realized that the stakes were higher than ever. Our conversation had moved beyond casual flirtation and into territory where every word could have lasting consequences. I left the conversation open-ended, aware that the next steps would be critical in defining our relationship. I finished my drink in silence, letting the weight of our exchange settle. David's next words, or even his silence, would determine the future course of our interactions. As I looked at him, I knew that we had reached a decisive moment, a point where I needed to decide whether to allow his persistent advances to reshape our connection or to assert my own boundaries more firmly. The night was far from over, and the decision that lay ahead would ultimately shape everything that followed. The next evening, I found myself alone at home again. I had chosen the tight dress that David always admired, knowing it would catch his eye. As I made my way downstairs, I could already sense the tension in the air. David was waiting in the living room with a glass of wine in his hand, his posture calm but his eyes betraying a hint of anticipation. When I sat down beside him, he broke the silence with a low, measured tone. "Do you know what you do to me?" he asked. His hand moved and rested on my shoulder. This time, I did not pull away. I met his gaze directly and replied, "And are you sure you want this?" My words were simple and direct, leaving little room for ambiguity. David leaned in closer, his presence overwhelming in the small space of the living room. I could feel his warm breath as he whispered, "I can't hold back any longer." His hand slid slowly down from my shoulder toward my waist. The room fell silent except for the steady sound of our breathing. Every movement was calculated, and the tension between us was palpable. For a moment, I allowed him to continue, to feel the closeness of his touch. Yet, at the very last second, I pulled back. "David, you have to prove that I can trust you," I said firmly, locking eyes with him. My tone was even and unyielding. His expression shifted instantly. Confusion and hesitation replaced the certainty he had worn moments before. He stopped in his tracks, seemingly at a loss for words as he tried to explain himself. Before he could form a response, the sound of the door opening cut through the charged silence. My mother stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What's going on here?" she exclaimed, her voice rising in alarm. David began to stutter an explanation, his words tumbling out as he tried to justify his actions. I raised my glass of wine, letting it rest firmly in my hand as I addressed him. "David, I thought you were stronger," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. My words were not meant to be cruel, but they carried a weight that left no room for further excuses. The shock in my mother's eyes grew, and without another word, she stepped forward. Her presence was commanding, and she swiftly escorted David out of the house that very night. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed was thick with unspoken consequences. I stood there for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The confrontation had ended abruptly, leaving behind a mix of relief and uncertainty. I felt a strange sense of victory, as if I had reclaimed control over a situation that had been spiraling out of control. I had played my game until the very end, and now, with David gone, it seemed that all the power had shifted into my hands. Yet, even in that moment of apparent triumph, the reality of the situation pressed in. I knew that the decisions I made in that instant would have lasting consequences. The power dynamics between us had been twisted for so long, and now the final act had unfolded in a way that left no room for retreat. I sat back down on the sofa, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of everything. Earlier, over the past few weeks, David's behavior had escalated steadily from casual comments and measured gestures to outright advances that blurred every line. From our tense lunch meeting to the walk in the park, and then to the private conversation in his office, every encounter had built up to this moment. His persistent attempts to shape our interactions were now exposed for what they were, a carefully controlled play where he tried to dictate the rules. Tonight, in the living room with my mother's unexpected intervention, the final act of that play had reached its climax. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the cool liquid ground me in the present. The room was quiet again, the only sound the distant hum of the night outside. My mother's footsteps receded down the hall, and I was left alone with my thoughts. The confrontation had forced me to confront not only David's intentions, but also my own desires and fears. I had long suspected that his interest was never purely about support or admiration. There was always a personal cost attached to every interaction, a price that I was not willing to pay without clear proof of trust and mutual respect. I recalled the moments from earlier in the evening, the way his hand had hesitated on my shoulder, the intensity in his eyes when he spoke those few words. I had seen enough to know that if I allowed the situation to continue unchecked, I might lose myself in a relationship defined by imbalance and control. Tonight had been the moment of reckoning. My refusal to fully surrender, to let him take the final step without demonstrating his commitment to change, was a stand I needed to take. As I sat there, I began planning my next moves. I needed to reassess every interaction with David, every gesture, and every word that had led to this point. My instincts told me that this was not the end of our story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter where I would set the terms of any future relationship. I knew that I had to be cautious. The power I felt now could easily shift back if I allowed myself to be vulnerable again without proper assurances. I wondered how my mother would react in the days to come, and what consequences might unfold from tonight's events. Would she see my actions as justified, or would it create a deeper rift in our family? The uncertainty was unsettling, but I also recognized that the situation demanded that I take responsibility for my own choices. The irony was not lost on me. The very game I had played to regain control had led to an unexpected twist. In the midst of everything, I realized that trust was the one element still missing. David's advances, his persistent need for validation, had always hinged on an unspoken promise, a promise that I could never accept without real evidence of sincerity. Tonight, that evidence had been demanded, and David had failed to provide it. With a final look around the now quiet living room, I set my glass down and made a decision. I would no longer allow myself to be manipulated by empty promises and half measures. I resolved to take charge of my future, even if it meant facing difficult truths and making hard choices about the relationships that defined my life. In that decisive moment, I understood that everything was about to change. The stakes had never been higher, and the next steps would require all the strength and clarity I could muster. I would wait for the fallout, prepare for the conversations that were sure to follow, and most importantly, ensure that my own needs and boundaries were respected above all else. As the night drew on, I sat alone, aware that the true climax of this ongoing conflict was only just beginning. The game had ended tonight, but its consequences would ripple through every aspect of my life in the days ahead. And so, with a steady breath and unwavering resolve, I prepared myself for whatever came next, knowing that I had finally reclaimed the power that was always rightfully mine.